All right, Dr. Jen, welcome back. How you doing?
I'm doing well today, Paul. How are you?
Good. I kind of was telling you about the anniversary trip behind the scenes, but as well, at least all my clients know, we're recording this as of August 20th, and my wife Teresa and I just got back from our anniversary trip to Italy, Greece, and Turkey. So it was 2 days in Rome and then a 7 day Mediterranean cruise. Of course, by the second to last day, I ended up getting sick, which is typical for me on a cruise. I don't know why I keep going on them, other than Teresa likes them. But it was an amazing trip, and we'll probably save that conversation for another day. I actually missed you because I feel like it's been forever since you and I last talked. Is that just me?
It's been a month as usual, but it does feel like a long time. It's interesting. Just, hey, I'm sorry that you got sick, and I'm sorry that you're getting over it right now. And, just thinking about that idea of getting sick on vacation, it is such a human experience. And this isn't our topic for today, but just one thing that I often talk with my clients about is so often our body recovers when we have the opportunity to. So like our kids might get sick over holiday break or over summer breaks, or we might get sick on vacation. And a lot of that is that we're kind of carrying ourselves as best we can through, to get us to those vacations or to get us to that day off. And we're building up this allostatic load in our nervous system that our bodies can only really do so much for so long. And so, as frustrating as it is, we often do get sick or recover in those moments when we really just want to be relaxing or resting, and our body is finally getting the opportunity to heal.
That's I. This is the second. So I've been on. Can't believe I'm going to say this. I've been on 4 cruises the last 2 years, and the very first one I went on was a Disney cruise. I ended up getting COVID like on day 3, and it's the first time I ever tested positive for COVID. Who knows if I had it before? And it was such a miserable experience. Like I had to go and drink like a $500 glass of bourbon and couldn't really even taste it. It was like one of these tasting things that you go on the cruises, and so you get like this little tiny sample of this $500 bottle of bourbon. And it's like I'm not even gonna enjoy this, but I had to
Mhm.
go because I had already paid for it. I'm like I didn't want to miss out. Yeah, that sucks. It just stinks
I know, I know. I wish it weren't true. When
because I,
I've
I know for us it was such a buildup of getting to the point of just being able to get to the trip. Like
Mhm.
we left on Thursday, and I was still packing like 2 hours before we were supposed to be leaving for the airport.
Yep, yeah. I often say to people I supervise as therapists that, if we don't decide when to rest, our body will decide for us, and it may not be when is convenient for us.
Yeah, that's a really good point because the one thing I learned in Rome, the one guide that we had that was giving us the tour of the Colosseum and the Vatican and St. Peter's. She's like, the thing with you Americans is that you think that you have to work really, really hard to deserve a break or time off versus just taking the time off.
Hmm. Right, right. It is interesting.
Why are we wired that way? Like, it's an American thing, right?
It feels like it. It really does feel like it. It's like this kind of deservedness, or, that we earn our rest. It may factor in a bit to our topic today of, when do we get additional supports? Because I do think that we have this, it's double-edged. There's a work ethic that many of us have, that hard work is good, and if we're good at something, if we're having an impact, we should do more of it. And we can put ourselves last, and we're not actually serving people as well as we think we are when we're not taking good care of ourselves. So I'm glad that this trope is more well known, that idea of putting on your own oxygen mask first. We talk about that, but we don't do that particularly well. So I'm glad it's part of our conversation, and I'm hoping that you and I and all the people listening can remember this, because I do it too. Oh, let me just squeeze in a couple more patients, or let me just work another day because I can, and we can. for a period of time, and then we can't. And so I think it's a real skill to be able to really watch our internal experience and see when we're starting to get to that point where we need a break, rather than that binary sense of it's too late, I'm over that line, now I'm going to get sick, or now I'm going to shut down or have to take days off.
I think one of the things that makes this harder for me now that I have the firm and I don't have to pull on like every lever to make sure everything's operating right and clients are being families are being taken care of is that I enjoy it so much that it just the time just kind of like
Mhm.
and it's something I was thinking about yesterday. I didn't know if I was going to bring it up on our conversation today is that it's already Wednesday and I feel like this week has just been a blur and I can think back to a week ago of where I was at. So a week ago I would have been in where would I was it? Mykonos. I was in Mykonos in Greece and the time the early part of the trip felt like it was like really slow and it didn't really feel like it went by fast until kind of the end. But just being back home, like this speed is just incredible.
Yes.
I don't know where we go with that, but it's something I've really noticed.
Yeah, yeah. I noticed it too, and it's interesting. I've been back for about 10 days from my big summer vacation with my family.
Yeah,
We went to Utah for a couple weeks, and I noticed the same thing. Those 2 weeks, really we're diving into adventures and relaxing and just being. And then I come home and a week goes by in a flash. The same, same duration of time. I've been
right.
back now for almost as long as I was gone, and it just felt instantaneous. And it's neither good nor bad, but I think there is, it brings me back to that topic we've talked about a few times of mindfulness and awareness, where we're putting our attention. We have so much, our favorite word, we have so much agency about that, because when we're on vacation, for better or for worse, we are hopefully, sucking every minute of that experience out if we're not getting sick, or, we're focusing in on the things we wanted to do, or taking pictures. We're really in that experience with all of our senses. And then we come back to daily life and we're not in the moment as much. We're planning, or, we were just talking before we started recording about kids going back to school and we're getting on all the email lists and we're, scheduling out all the games and all of that. And we're not really in our present moment. We're not really in our body in the way that we are when we take that minute to rest and be on vacation. And so I guess maybe the way that I want to tie all that together here is we don't have to wait for those grand events, those 2 week vacations or the international trip or the cruise. Those are wonderful. We are so fortunate if we get to have those moments with our family or our loved ones. And also, we can take mini vacations. And it is something that I try to do during my day when I remember, or if I can remind myself or my clients that a 5 minute vacation is almost as good for our nervous system as the anticipation of that 2 week vacation, that specific moment in the vacation. And that doesn't mean that we have to like take us ourselves somewhere in that moment, but to be able to stop and slow down and maybe ground ourselves, look around, notice what we're seeing and feeling, maybe smell something or look at a picture. We can take ourselves to a place of relaxation much faster than we think we can. And our body responds to that as like, it's almost like in your world where we might make small investments every month rather than one huge investment every year. And it's going to stack up. The bank account doesn't care the frequency with which we do that, right? It just wants us to be adding to it and remember to invest. And our body and our nervous system is very similar.
Yeah, it's that whole power of compounding that we've talked about. I've talked about it on several solo podcast shows that I've done. So how do you it's kind of like in my world when providing guidance to families from a financial and a lifestyle standpoint, like how do you help people to while they may be aware that break is great, whether it's 5 minutes or 10 minutes, how do you get people to and maybe we talked about this before, and I just want to rehash it because it seems like it's always a sticking point in the advice business, whether you're a therapist like yourself or an advisor like me, to help people actually do the work. So
Mhm.
they could be aware of it. Like I'm aware of it. Like what you just said, like I've read those studies before where taking that 5 minute break in the middle of the day can do wonders for you. And how many of us actually do that? Probably
Mhm.
not that, not
Right, right. Well, It's kind of a combination of things. One, there's just straight out remembering, right? That's one piece. And then there's after time, can it become a habit? So I think for remembering, I am not at all opposed to using additional tools to help remember. For me, I'm pretty old school. That's often like a post-it note. Just little notes
That
all
is
over
old
the
school,
place.
Dr. Jen.
Yeah, and maybe a topic for another podcast. Like I freely acknowledge I have ADHD, right? This is something that I work with myself on, and so I'm going to use executive functioning tools to remind myself of things. So that might be a timer on our phone or a little alert, or we don't want to overdo it because we can get alert fatigue where it's like every 30 seconds stand up and stretch and take a break. But if there are ways that we can remind ourselves, then we have the opportunity to start make a habit. And habits are really effective, particularly when we really actually care about them and or pair them with something that we enjoy. So, maybe there's something that you look forward to every morning and you pair that with a habit that you're trying to start. Or if you're really trying to get in the habit of taking a 5-minute vacation, maybe you do that as part of your lunch break. Or what I like to do really is schedule that in between two things that I think might be challenging or right after something that's challenging. So if I'm working with somebody who's in a lot of distress, I might schedule a little vacation for myself, just 5 minutes or 10 minutes right after that, or if I have to have a tough phone call with somebody. So I've gotten in the habit over time of saying, okay, this is going to be tricky and I'm going to take care of myself that way. And just because I know we've talked about this on the podcast, it also makes me think of some of our sports psychology, or like with my rock climbing. If I do something that is really challenging for my body tells me that, right? It needs a rest or it needs recovery. I need to, kind of shake out my hands because my muscles are sore. And so it's kind of like that mental equivalent of that. We're like kind of shaking out our minds or shaking out our nervous system, like, whew, that was a lot. And so we can also develop a habit of internally sensing what's happening. Is my heart rate higher? Am I feeling a little shaky? Am I feeling tense? Am I clenching my jaw, right? We have these tells for when we're tense or stressed that we might just not notice, but we can get in the habit of paying attention to them and saying, oh, that's interesting information. Maybe I need to take care of myself in a different way for a minute right now.
Yeah, that's also a topic I know that we talked about. Is I think that was the title of the podcast, is like our emotions are information, and it's both mentally and physically. I know the habit stacking is pretty popular by James Clear. I know Katie Milkman, another behavioral scientist out of Wharton,
Mm-hmm.
Pennsylvania, has done that. I've read that in her book, where like if you're working out, that's like your only time that you can watch like Netflix or
Mm-hmm.
listen to a podcast, and something like that, and it really sticks.
Absolutely.
So I have like several questions in my mind. So I'm going to go really off track, because I remember your vacation, and one of the things that you were trying to hold yourself accountable for was not to burn your boys out, and they were going to limit you to like how many activities you could do a day. How did that go?
They got what they wanted. It was really great. And so did I, actually. You're right. So if anybody didn't hear that episode yet, I typically travel with my family to Utah for a couple weeks every summer for many reasons. It's just a beautiful place. There's rock climbing, there's adventures there. We're fortunate to have a beautiful place to stay there. A couple years ago, my boys said, Mom, can we have only one adventure per day? And I didn't realize that I was kind of holding them on my schedule where I want to just be out all day and adventuring because I can, right? That's my time to do that. So we really did that this year, and have for the past couple years, where every day or two we'd go out for a morning adventure and then we'd come back and they could chill and they could do their thing and be the adolescent boys that they are. And it was great. I felt my husband said it was actually his favorite time that we've been there, and I think that was a big piece of it, is that all of us were doing our own thing. I had some friends come and visit me so I could get my adventure itch scratched, and the boys could just hang out and go get donuts and relax, and it was great.
Now, do your boys climb as well?
They do. They do. They're not quite as into it as I am, but they will go with me. And my older one in particular is really into the idea of climbing with the adults right now. And he says he'll climb anything I will. So I put him to the test.
All right, interesting. And then for those of you that keep up with every episode that Dr. Jen and I do, Scotty Streffler won again on the tour. So I don't think winning is getting old for him, but as we know, it doesn't really impact Scotty that much. So I just thought I'd point that out. And a little bit behind the scenes, like sometimes before we hit record, Dr. Jenna will have like conversations before we hit the record button. But honestly, we are literally deciding what we're going to talk about just seconds before we hit record. And so I'm like looking at the clock, and we're like 16 minutes into this conversation, and we're nowhere near like the topic that we wanted to pick out to talk about today, which I think all aligns to what we've been talking about, is kind of this awareness that you have with things that you want to do, but you're still afraid to take that first step, and you know that you need professional help, whether it's working with a therapist such as yourself or an advisor like me. Is how does one really go about making that decision finally? Like, what's the straw that the proverbial straw that breaks the camel's back?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and I appreciate having the opportunity to really talk about that. So the question that we're thinking about today is, when would someone seek therapy? When would someone seek out a financial advisor? And when do we need more support? When would we benefit from more support? Obviously it's a very personal question, and there are also resources involved. Neither of us do our work for free, so, people have to have the resources to be able to do the kind of work that we're talking about. But it's not always as high a barrier as people think it is. There are many, many ways to access therapeutic support, and, private practice, private pay is one of them, but many people can access therapy through their insurance provider or talk with their doctor and get referrals for low cost or even no cost services. There's a huge array of therapy. But when we kind of pull back and just think about therapy in general, psychotherapy, going to see a therapist one-on-one, the way that many people see me, there are a lot of reasons that people decide to come to therapy. And, so I'll tell you just some of the things that people tell me when I have my initial consultation call with them. The number one thing I hear from people is, I've been meaning to do this for a long time. And,
Yes,
finally, it
I hear
seems
that
like the
too.
time. Yeah. And usually I ask that. I say, why now? What made you decide to reach out now? Because I know it's not an easy call to make to either of us, right? It's not, people don't wake up saying like, I finally get to go and see an advisor. I finally get to go see a therapist. It's like, all right, it's time, right? And so usually what I notice is that something has happened in somebody's life where they feel like it's kind of beyond their expertise. They're dealing with an interpersonal challenge. That's probably the main reason that people decide to come to therapy, is there's some interpersonal challenge that's gotten to them, whether it's a relationship piece, or they're struggling with something at work or with a friend or as a parent or with their own parents, or they might be noticing that they have symptoms of some mental health condition. And I deliberately say symptoms because we don't have to have a DSM diagnosis to benefit from therapy. And if that term isn't familiar to any of
Yeah,
the
I was going to say, if
listeners,
you can explain that.
so DSM stands for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's basically the diagnostic Bible, so to speak, of therapists and psychiatrists. It's what we look in, and we get all this training in it to be able to diagnose somebody, to say, oh, you have major depressive disorder, or you have generalized anxiety disorder, or you have schizophrenia, or whatever it is that somebody might be coming in with. And it's a good manual. It's not perfect. We're on our fifth revision now over many, many years. And if you look back over, the decades of changes, our diagnoses have changed a lot over the past, 50, 60, 70 years. So it's not set in stone. I mention that because sometimes that's the hesitation that people have with coming to therapy. I don't know if I really have a diagnosis, or I don't know if I really meet criteria, or if I need it as much as somebody else does. My response is often that, there's no blood test for depression, there's no blood test for anxiety, but we know it when we feel it. And those diagnostic criteria, it's, do you have 7 of these 9 things? Or do you have, 3 categories of these 6 things? I'm not anti-diagnosis, but in some ways it doesn't matter in terms of the talk therapy, and in terms of, the way that I see people and the way that I approach the work. So more than I have this diagnosis, usually it's like, this isn't working. my approach to my life isn't working in the way that I want it to. Or people might realize that they're trying to break some generational patterns. A lot of the people that I work with, and I'm curious if you notice this too, I often refer to them as the cycle breakers, that they, for whatever reason, are the first generation in their family to really see the dynamics as clearly as they do, to see, perhaps with compassion or perhaps not with compassion, wow, maybe my parents were limited or they did the best they could, but they didn't get the modeling that they needed. And we can kind of track the generations. And then it kind of comes to the person sitting in front of me, like, I don't want to do that. I don't want my kids to be sitting in therapy talking about the same things, or I don't want to be the kind of parent that I experienced, right? Even if my parent was a wonderful person, I want to do better. Or I've been walking around my whole life with this and it stops now. I don't want to have these worries or this weight or whatever it is that's kind of, carrying around on my shoulders, that I want some help with that. I want some tips or tools or guidance. And so what people are often asking me for is kind of an array of things. Sometimes they really want specific skills or tips, things to try, homework assignments or things to write about. Fantastic, right? Therapy can do that. Some people have no interest in that. They really want a witness to their process of being able to talk about maybe the traumas that they've experienced. A huge piece of what I do, and I imagine this is probably true for you, is psychoeducation or just education in general. A lot of my work is essentially reassuring people you're normal, you're
Yeah.
not broken, this is exactly what human bodies do, this is what the nervous system does. People who are unintelligent, right? These are smart people, they may be top of their field, but
Right.
we weren't born with expertise about how our bodies work and our brains work and our nervous systems work. So there's a big hefty dose of helping people understand that we know our entire experience, the good, bad, and the ugly, and we know a very small sliver of other people's experiences, and we're often comparing ourselves to what we see versus what we know about ourselves, and we come out on the losing end, right? I'm not good enough, I'm less than, because we think that we're seeing the reality of somebody else's life. And I'm in such a privileged position to be able to see the reality of so many people's lives and be able to say wholeheartedly, you're not alone, right? This is a human experience.
Yeah, no, I would confer a lot of the things that you just touched on, and I kind of attribute those back to these, I think, overriding fears that people have, like that there's this stigmatism, if you will, if I don't know if that's the right word, about coming to work with somebody like you or somebody like me, that they're less than, and I don't see that at all. And like you, I've got this very critical front row seat to people's personal lives, both financial and emotional and lifestyle. And I think that's like another fear that I think people have, is like finding out that they're going to be further behind than they thought, or they haven't started, so they don't necessarily know where to turn. And I think that's one of the reasons why I think like 78% of the families I work with have come to me either through knowing me personally and what I do, or through an existing family that I work with. It's that warmth of knowing that I've had a conversation with somebody. They like I'm legit. I'm what's the word?
Like you're safe, right? You're
Yeah,
trusted.
safe. Yeah, because I think a lot of people don't know where. They know therapists are out there, they know advisors are out there, but they don't know who the good ones are, if
Hmm.
that makes sense. And so trying to find somebody like yourself or me that they gel with is, I think that's a roadblock for them. Like, well, I don't know where to start, so I'm not going to start at all.
Right.
But
Yeah.
going back to one of the other things that you mentioned too is, I don't, off the top of my head, I would say the vast majority, so probably like 80% of the 60 plus families I work with are probably first time families, meaning they've never
Hmm.
worked with an advisor before.
Hmm.
And the interesting thing about, and I don't know if I mentioned this before about TAMMA, is how generational it has become. I work with families that are in our life stage right now. So we have kids that are growing, developing, but I also have families that are a little bit older that have kids that have come through high school, that have come through college, that are now working. So I'm working with them. And I'm also working with, our parents, like the grandparents, if you will. And it's become this whole intergenerational community, if you will, that I would have never thought of that way when I first started building the firm. But I have to say, it's amazing. It's amazing on so many different levels to be able to see kids grow up and to be able to support families like when they get into the retirement years and not know where to turn to. And it's very rewarding. It kind of goes back to what I was mentioning earlier. It's easy to love what I do. Even on my worst day at TAMMA is better than my best day I ever had in my corporate career.
Yeah, I really agree. And, that I think that is another area of overlap. I often wake up and look at my schedule and I'm like, oh my gosh, I get to see these people I like so much. It's just
Yeah,
such a privilege, really. I know I've used that word a lot today, but, and like you, a lot of my clients at this point in my career come to me because of word of mouth. Some friend of theirs has worked with me, or someone in their faith community has worked with me, or their parents have worked with me. I find that to be just the most flattering and the most,
agreed.
stamp of approval. Like, oh my gosh, to your point about stigma, that these people I've worked with are happy enough to talk about their as something that they're proud of having done, right?
Right.
And then to recommend it to people they love, and then to recommend that they work with me. It all just it feels like such a beautiful snowball. There are just to wrap up on that topic of when to seek therapy. What I was mentioning earlier is kind of the optional times to seek therapy. And I don't mean optional like it may not be important. I'm obviously biased, but I think it's all important. I think it's all really good work. There are times that I think people really need to seek therapy. And so I would be remiss not to mention those here,
Yeah.
because when we get into the diagnostic criteria, or when we get into really looking at like a disorder of some sort, one of the main things that we're looking at is the impact on someone's life. And so for me, when I'm talking with someone, that's one of my questions is how is this impacting your life? I hear you talking about your anxiety, or I hear you talking about, traumas that you've experienced in the past, which most people who come to see me just because of my expertise have some history of trauma. When it gets to the point where whatever those symptoms are getting in the way of you living the way that you want to be living. Maybe it's impacting your relationships, maybe it's impacting your ability to work or to be a parent or to take the rest that we've been talking about, we spoke about it in the beginning. Those are the times that it becomes more important to seek additional support. And probably true in the financial world too, where if you are getting in trouble, and that's, I think, actually where more of the stigma lies these days is, what's wrong with me that I can't just, like, that's my least favorite word, just, that I
Just,
can't
yeah.
just, tough it out, or I can't just do better at work, or, there's often, again, that social comparison. Well, yeah, lots of people have trauma and they're not, flattened by it in the way that I am right now. I think those are some real indicators that some professional support could be helpful, that we don't have to do this alone. You don't need to be suffering in the way that you are. Or, sometimes it's feedback from other people in our world, like, hey, Jen, you are not making it through this in the way that you think you are, or you're not yourself, or I miss you. I haven't really felt you in the room for a long time. And then, to the extreme, I really want people seeking treatment if they're having thoughts about hurting themselves or not wanting to be alive. And I know that might seem obvious, but it's not always.
Right.
And that doesn't scare us. So I want to be really clear. Therapists can have those conversations. I can talk with someone about self-harm without freaking out. I can talk with someone, we all can talk with someone about suicidal thoughts without freaking out. And actually it's normal to have thoughts about that. But does it get beyond that? right? Are you having thoughts of really doing something? Are you having thoughts about really hurting somebody else? That's when it starts to be not optional, that we really need that additional support. What I see so frequently is that that's a very brief moment in time for most people, that level of crisis or like anger, that's another thing that people often reach out, like my anger is out of control. I'm yelling at my kids or I'm yelling at strangers. Like those are blips in our life if we're careful. If we get into some support, some treatment, learn some skills, or just even hear ourselves talking about it out loud, that doesn't have to be a pattern that gets established. It doesn't have to stick around, but it will tell us that it should. So sometimes we can get stuck in that like depressive cycle where everything we see is through the lens of depression, let's say, and feelings love themselves. They want to stick around. And so depression in particular is one of those emotions that it will try to convince you that it's always been that way and that it's never going to change. And that is such a fallacy. It's not true. But sometimes we can't see that in the moment.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that's the thing with depression is it's hard to see that it's not forever or hasn't been forever.
Right, right. So, I think part of my role, and again, probably part of your role on the financial side, is to be able to take that bird's eye view and to be able to hold both the hope that I know this doesn't have to last forever and the history. I've known you before this, or, I can remember a time, or you've told me about times when this wasn't part of you. So I know that's not true, right? And we don't want to invalidate the experience. It feels like it's true. And what are we gaining by believing the depression here? Can we take a different outlook? Maybe there's behavioral activation to try, maybe there's medications to try, or maybe there's collateral support to pull in. Maybe it's just being in the presence of someone like me or you who can witness this and not reject them, not push away, which is what depression tells you is going to happen. So there's a real corrective emotional experience in therapy that's not just about learning skills. It's also about being witnessed by someone and still being deemed acceptable.
One of the things that you had mentioned that I hadn't really even thought about, I think about social comparison a lot, which is one of the reasons why I, killed my Facebook and Instagram accounts last year, and I'm so happy that I did it. Is like when I think of social comparison that way, I always automatically go to like the numbers because that's what people ask me. Like, well, I see these people like going on vacations and doing all these different things. Like, how do they afford to do that? But you just made me think about there's an emotional component to that, just like there's a financial component.
Yeah. Yeah, there really is. And social media is actually usually the example that I use for that because we know how curated that is. Like we know
Yes,
it
it's everybody's
logically.
highlight reel. Like,
Totally.
and I've been living it the last week because like Teresa's been posting like every day, like she would post like what we did and pictures and things like that. And while it's cool, in the back of my mind thinking like, do I really want you to do that, Teresa? Like, is it like, are we like showboating? Like, did
Hmm.
it that kind of stuck with me, and I'm like, well, I don't tell her what to do when it comes to things like that. So like, but it's something that she's proud of too because I know how hard that we have worked both emotionally and financially to be able to get
Hmm.
to a point like this, to be able to go on a trip like this. Hell, it was like we've been planning this thing for almost 10 years. So our wedding anniversary is in October and it'll be 19 years. And we had been planning it since our 10-year anniversary that we've never done anything like this before.
Yeah, it's a tricky balance. There is an aspect of sharing online that's really connecting, and there's authenticity in that. Sometimes I run into someone I haven't seen in months, and they'll say, "Oh, I love watching your adventures, or I love seeing your boys grow up," and that's real, right? That's happening.
Yes. Yeah.
And we're not posting how sick we feel on our vacation, right? We're not
Yeah.
posting how
I don't think
disappointed
Teresa
we
took any
are.
pictures of me when I was like heaved over like in pain, like I'm not gonna
Right.
make it.
Exactly. And nor should she, right? But then, all we see is, like you said, the highlight reel. And we go through and we curate and we share these 5 pictures of this week-long adventure that we had, or this beautiful experience, or, here's me out to dinner on my anniversary. And we're absolutely not sharing, here's me scowling at my partner at 8 in the morning the next day, or, here's me disheveled, rushing my kids out the door. But that happens too. And so that comparative piece is really tricky because we know, and in fact, humans are evolved to really focus on all the potentially threatening information, all the scary information so that we stay alive. So we're compiling internally all our failures for the day. I don't want us to do this. Remember, we talked about pride practice, but we do. We just do. And so, in a given hour, we can find 10 ways that we have messed up something. And then we look at our friend's beautiful vacation. And we forget for a minute that they too are a human going through all of that lived experience. So that makes me think of one other thing in terms of therapy, which I haven't mentioned, I think, ever on this podcast, which is there's also group therapy. And, there's
Yeah.
individual therapy, there's family therapy, there's couples therapy, and then there's group therapy. And that is also a beautiful experience. I don't get to do as much of that now as I used to when
I
I
was gonna
worked
say,
in.
did you used to do the
I
group
used
therapy?
to.
I don't know if you still do or not, but
I'd love to do it more. It's definitely something that's in the back of my mind. When I worked for larger healthcare systems, I did a lot of group therapy for lots of reasons. It's super effective. You can see a lot of people at once. And there is a social healing component because we do get to see that window into other people's lives. We do get that shared emotional experience. And it is 10 times more effective for one person in a group to connect with another group member than it is for me to say, other people have this experience too. Feel it. And to hear someone talking, and this is another reason why when people are in recovery, going to things like AA or community meetings is so supportive because people feel so alone and ashamed and all of this stigma. And we haven't even mentioned addictions, but like that's another great reason to come into therapy. If there's a behavior that you're doing that isn't serving you, but you really can't stop, and looking around a room and seeing 50 other people who are dealing with the same thing, or 2 other people who are dealing with the same thing, we can get so hard on ourselves and we internalize all that stigma. What's wrong with me? I should be able to do this on my own. Other people can do it on their own. Well, guess what? Other people aren't doing it on their own, right? Other people are getting support, whether it's from me or you or family members, and we don't have to suffer in the way that we sometimes do.
that's a really interesting point because I've been trying to figure out for years now as the TAMMA tribe has grown, is putting people that maybe have gone through some life transitions, like kids going away to college and what an emotional transition and journey that can be, and having them actually talk with people, other parents that have gone through that experience. Because I think that's one of the lucky things that at least I think of as an advisor. I don't know if you do as a therapist, but like going through these journeys with people and having
Mm-hmm.
this front row seat, like it hopefully it's all helping to prepare me for the day that my triplets go off to college. I know we'll probably talk about this in our next episode, is the seasonal transitions that we go through, especially now that we're kind of entering fall and kids going back to school. And I just think of it, I mean, I think you don't think of like the first year or freshman year of high school being that big of a journey or a transition, but I'm finding that it is.
Yeah.
And I just have all these families that I've worked with for the last 20 years in my mind saying, just hold on, because these next 4 years are going to go, like we talk about where does time go early in this conversation. I feel like we've hit so many topics today,
Mm-hmm.
but it's going to go by so fast. It is going to go by so fast. And it's, I don't know how you slow that imaginary time machine down at all. Maybe that's another topic for a conversation too.
Yeah, probably is. For me, it always comes back to that present moment awareness, that real mindful moments, like trying to just be where our feet are, particularly in those moments when we feel that joy or when we feel that pride or we're watching our kid excel at something or try hard at something, and to try to really just be there rather than, oh no, this is almost over, or what are we doing tomorrow, or how am I going to get to the next thing? To just take that breath. And, maybe that's, coming back to that idea of habits, just taking that breath and being like, wow, Look what's happening right now. Look where I am right now. And, even for people who are listening, just to take that moment right now, like we're okay in this moment, right? Even though, Paul, you're not feeling perfect, you're okay, right? I'm okay. Everybody listening is okay right now. We might not be okay tomorrow, or maybe we weren't okay yesterday. But that is another thing that we focus on a lot in therapy is trying to get out of that, future tripping or living in the past. We're going to do that, but when we can kind of hone our attention back in, those moments seem to last longer. We get more of them because we're not zipping through them quite as quickly. And we also remember them. We can also mark them. We can celebrate them. We can be proud of them. We can be proud of ourselves in that moment. So it's kind of like just giving ourselves that time pause can be super tiny to just take that moment. We've talked about that idea of glimmers of like really feeling a connection or safety or joy. And that's what I'm talking about. Like, oh, wow, look at this. Look at this. This is great. Last thing I'll say on that, it just as a parent, because I think about this a lot too, I too have that sense of like, oh my gosh, how did my kids get so big? And we don't have that much more time, and they're going to be in the house, and right, I can go there. And I also can remember this is the most fun I've ever had with my kids. And you know what? I said that yesterday too. And I said that the day before too. Like it just gets more and more and more fun and challenging and all of those things too. But like, why wouldn't that continue? Why wouldn't that continue to be the way that I feel about them 10 years from now? 20 years from now, right? When we're in the moment that we're in, rather than, oh, they used to be so little, or I used to have a different role with them. We have a beautiful role with them now. They are who they are now. They're going to continue to grow and evolve. We get to watch that, that nothing bad is happening if we're really paying attention. It's just change, and change is okay. We can love that just as much.
I couldn't think of a better spot to wrap up this conversation because that was amazing. That's something that'll stick with me. And then also just to reiterate your point about after you're done listening to us talk, take 5 minutes and just pause and take that time out for yourself. So,
Mm.
well, Dr. Jen, I can't thank you enough. I always enjoy these monthly chats with you, and look forward to seeing you again next month.
Thanks, Paul. Me too.